far does freedom of speech really go? As an American, do you have the right to say anything that you want? Is it a violation of our rights if the president silences the press because he doesn't like what they are reporting on? Where should we draw the line when it comes to the freedom of the press? During the COVID pandemic, did the government go too far? If you've ever felt the weight of censorship, you might be wondering if your rights were violated. In today's episode, we're addressing these critical questions about freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Join me as we explore the limits of our rights and the role of governmental control. Welcome back to Voices of Liberty. I'm your host, Isabel, and I'm so thankful y'all are joining me again for yet another episode. The last two episodes were kind of a lot, so I really do hope that y'all are able to really understand everything. If you have to go back and listen to them again, I highly suggest you do that because I really want y'all to be sure that y'all have a general understanding of everything. This is a lot of information, so it's completely normal to be a little overwhelmed, but I just really wanted to kind of give a little brief overview of what we went over in the last two episodes. So the first episode, we went through the history of the Bill of Rights. In the second episode, we went through the First Amendment, the religious clauses, and then now we're going to be going through freedom of speech in the First Amendment. Before we really dig into this episode, I just want to give y'all a few reminders. And the first one is we're learning this together, y'all. This is a team effort, and it's supposed to be fun. I really want y'all to have fun when listening to this podcast. It is essential that as Americans, we know our rights so that we can better navigate life with liberty, truth, and grace. The second reminder is our weekly versing challenge. If you're on the email list, I highly suggest that you go and join our email list. I can link all of that in the show notes. But this is how we send out our weekly challenges and our weekly verses, and they tie into the podcast every week. We send out exclusive podcast episodes, discount codes to support different Christian conservative brands, and just blog posts that we've posted, just all kinds of things. So I highly suggest you go and join our email list. It is full of so much stuff. But our weekly verse was Proverbs 31:8-9, and it says, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy." That's Proverbs 31:8-9. And then the weekly challenge was to call your local pro-life center. I know you have one. And just ask if they're accepting any donations. You could donate diapers, wipes, onesies, baby formula. But it's just really a way to get involved in our communities, be the hands and feet of Jesus to these women who need help in our choosing life, and to support our local pro-life clinics. I think they would be really appreciated. If you take a picture of your items and then send it to me at youngccwives@gmail.com, I will feature it on the website. We have a spot for our weekly challenges, and I really want to just use it as a way to encourage and empower women to get more involved in their communities. I do ask that you do a heart check with it because it is not something for recognition, but more of just a way to encourage other women in Christ. And I think it's just a great way to do that. Okay, y'all, so it is time for our podcast shoutouts. If you're on the email list, they were given exclusive access to the episodes before it aired. And I want to give a shout out to Julia Davila, Sarah Beth Denton, and Autumn. They shared the podcast with their friends. They shared it on the Instagram story, sent it to one of their friends. I'm just so grateful for y'all. Thank y'all so much for sharing it. It truly means the world to me when people share because that lets me know that people appreciate it, that they're learning, and that they're expanding their knowledge and they're growing in their love for politics, in their love for America. So I'm just so grateful for that. Thank y'all so much for sharing. All right, the last thing is for this episode, it took so much prep work. I linked all of my sources in my show notes. So if you want to further your education, further your learning, read about stuff on your own, I linked all my sources. You are more than welcome to go and look at those. And I really recommend that you do because it's only going to help you. And it's just a great way to really expand your knowledge. So I do not want y'all to be overwhelmed. As I said earlier, I know it can be a little overwhelming. So if you have to go and listen to these episodes more than once, that's completely okay. I believe we need to speak up, and it is important that we have a general understanding of how our government functions, its importance, and what having rights even means in America. This podcast is meant to be educational, and I really hope that it is fun, it is enjoyable, and I really hope that by the end of it, you're able to break down all 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights, and you're able to name them just from your memory. So again, if you missed the last episode, I talked about the religious clauses in the First Amendment. That is the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Thereof Clause. The Establishment Clause deals with the government establishing a religion, whereas the Free Exercise Thereof Clause deals with the people's right to worship freely. So in that episode, I just broke down everything, explained what they meant, and then even gave you some verdicts that were handed down by the Supreme Court cases that address these topics specifically. These verdicts shed light on the practical application of these complex ideas. I'm going to be breaking down the First Amendment in multiple episodes because there is just so much to unpack in the First Amendment. I just want to be sure that I devote enough time to each topic for clarity and understanding. I want to give some examples and readings of the cases regarding this amendment, and it can take a bit of time. So if this podcast episode is a little bit longer than others, just be prepared because I'm going to be reading a lot of different things that deals with freedom of speech. With all of that being said, let's dive into the freedom of speech within the First Amendment. To start this episode, I want to read the First Amendment. I know we read it in the last episode, but I'm going to be reading it a lot just so you kind of get it in your mind and begin to memorize it. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. All right, y'all, so now we're going to get into the fun part. What is freedom of speech? And what is the extent of this freedom? It's important to remember that if we did not have the First Amendment, the rest of the amendments would not exist. It's important to understand the context that laid the foundations for the First Amendment. Why did the Founding Fathers feel that it was necessary to even include the First Amendment in the first place? The Founding Fathers directly experienced what it was like to have their thoughts and speech suppressed. So when our Founding Fathers were under the rule of Britain, it was illegal to criticize the British government and rule, even if their criticisms were true. They did not have the freedom to voice their political opinions, and it was the same when it came to the press. Before the American Revolution, the British Parliament imposed the Stamp Act on colonists, taxing them for paper products and goods. So I want y'all to just kind of put yourself in their situation and imagine what it would be like. You are a normal colonist, you are living in the new land, and you are under the rule of Britain. Can you imagine what it would be like to be fearful of saying the wrong thing and being arrested, or saying something ill of a political official and getting arrested or taxed heavily, or whatever the case is? The British government was aware of this, and so what they did in turn was impose the Stamp Act. While you may say, okay, they were taxing paper goods and products, that's not really a big deal, it is. This censored speech by making it more difficult for those of a lower class to publish articles and essays within the newspaper. When drafting the Bill of Rights, they wanted to ensure that the right of free speech and of the press was mentioned in the First Amendment. They really wanted to ensure that Americans had the right to criticize public officials and voice their opinions about who is governing them. This was just another way to ensure that there were checks and balances put in place of our government officials. Okay, we're going to take a little pause for a second so I can tell you about the Anastasia Co. The Anastasia Co. is a clothing, stationery, and gift brand on a mission to share truth and encouragement through thoughtfully designed products. In their shop, you'll find beautiful shirts, hats, journals, wall art, stickers, and so much more. To shop, visit shop.theanastasiaco.com. If you use the code CCWives10, it will get you 10% off your order. I own her Coffee Plus Kingdom Work hat and her planner, and I always get so many compliments in the hat. And I use the planner a lot when prepping for this podcast. It helps keep me organized and just stay on track. So again, if you go get yours today at shop.theanastasiaco.com, code CCWives10 to get 10% off your order. When free speech and free press flourish, they ensure that those in office are held accountable. It is important to note that there is a limit to our speech. For example, I can write a thought-out review of a political official giving my opinion, but I cannot incite violence towards them in my review. I can express my disagreements with them and why. So if you need a further example of this, I can't say, I want everyone to meet at this address at XYZ time and do X, Y, and Z to this and this public official. That is inciting violence. You cannot do that. And there are times, however, when our government has infringed on Americans' right of free speech. That's something I want to kind of just us to think about for a minute. So going back to the question of what is freedom of speech? Freedom of speech essentially just refers to the natural right of individuals to communicate their thoughts with others through speech. This is separate, y'all. Keep this in mind. This is separate from freedom of the press. Freedom of the press is being the right of individuals or groups to communicate with others through permanent mediums. This would be like newspapers, internet, televisions, magazines, posters, pamphlets. This separation is important because otherwise it would not have been included. The Founding Fathers were trying to protect freedom of expression for both individuals and groups, both private and commercial. So I'm going to read y'all the First Amendment again, but I want to put the emphasis on freedom of speech. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. When it comes to our freedom of speech, we are limited in what we can say. When studying for this podcast, I actually read a law review article and listened to a few sources on this. The law review article that I read basically just focused on the idea that we should restrict freedom of speech for the purpose of public good. The author literally said in the article that restricting it should be done through the legislature or Congress. Personally, to me, this doesn't really make any sense, and it directly contradicts the language in the First Amendment. I want you all to imagine that you are going to the theater. Maybe you're going to a Broadway show, maybe you're going to see a new movie, or maybe you're going to see a ballet. If you're like me, I go see different ballets. I love ballet. You go to this beautiful theater, but when the show starts, the lights go off, right? What if someone got up and started yelling, "Fire"? There's a fire. They start screaming, and then what is the reaction from everyone else? Does everyone else just sit there and hope for the best? No. Everybody gets their butt up, and they scramble to the door. They probably trample people in the process. It's probably a very, very traumatic thing. And that's mainly because you think that the building is literally on fire. But what if there isn't a fire? This is the example that the author gave in this law article that I read. But the question I have to ask myself is the problem their speech, or does the problem lie in their intentional lying that caused injury or death to some of the people? In a way, this action is like selling a drug that claimed to cure, let's just say, for example, baldness, but it actually causes you to lose all the hair on your body. Yelling fire if there is a fire is okay. Selling the cure for baldness is okay if it works with no side effects. This kind of speech does not seem to be a form of expression, but rather something like pushing someone in front of a moving car. This opens up a whole entire debate about inciting violence, what that means for our discourse on social media, and how it should be weighed with the public good. It's the idea of just because you can does not mean that you should. And just a little disclaimer, a lot of people say that the fire example, fire and there's no fire, that people use that example a lot today, and a lot of people say that it's the test for the Supreme Court when they're looking at different cases regarding freedom of speech. That is actually not true. This was actually mentioned by a Supreme Court justice in the case Shank v. United States, and we'll talk about that case later on in the episode, but it's not really used as a tester anymore when deciding cases like this. This example of yelling fire in a crowded theater is basically just used in the general public when Americans are referring to their freedom of speech. I want to give an example before I start this because this was brought up on the Facebook group actually yesterday, and I thought it was really interesting. So there was a post made, and this post was essentially just giving some insight into what happened in this news article recently. Essentially, without going into so many details, this lady who was a realtor apparently went to eat at this restaurant. I don't know if she was mad at the service or what, but she wrote this note on the napkin, and it basically said, "No tip, I hope you get deported." While that is an extreme thing to say to literally anyone, it's terrible and it's sad. She should not have said this, but it is freedom of speech. She's not going to get arrested for saying that. However, there are social consequences because now the general public knows about it. They know who she is. So she has lost her job, her husband's business is tanking, and on top of that, her business license to practice real estate is in question. This woman absolutely, in this example, had freedom of speech. She had the freedom to say what she wanted. But that doesn't mean that there are not social consequences that follow. And it comes along with the idea of just because you can does not mean that you should. Just because she can say that does not mean that she should say that. So that's just a little example I wanted to give. While it's a sad, sad thing, I am praying for everyone involved in that situation. But it was just really interesting to me to see, because it was a little poll and what I wanted to see what everyone voted on. And it's funny because I'm literally talking about this today. So the next case I want to talk about is the Alienus v. United States case. This case is pretty recent and it deals with freedom of speech regarding social media. So I'm going to read the facts from this case just to kind of give you a little indicator, because there is a lot that goes into this case. I'm going to try to get through it a little bit to where you can easily understand. But I'm reading this article from drexel.edu, and I linked all this in my sources. It says, rap lyrics often contain violent imagery. But when Anthony Alienus posted some on his Facebook describing him wanting his wife's head on a stick, making a name for himself by shooting up a kindergarten class, fantasizing about killing an FBI agent, they became a cause for concern. He was arrested and convicted under 18 U.S. charges, a federal law prohibiting threats in the interstate commerce. Alienus challenged the conviction on the grounds that the jury was instructed that a reasonable person would interpret his words to be a threat, but not whether they were a true threat. Indeed, he had included disclaimers on his post indicating that the lyrics were fictitious and therapeutic. So I want y'all to think about this for a second. How do you think this case should be handled? He posted these rap lyrics on his Facebook and indicated that it was fictitious and therapeutic. Should he have said it? Absolutely not. So this is from OIEZ.com. It says, Anthony Alienus was convicted under 18 U.S. charges, which criminalizes the transmission of threats in interstate commerce. For posting threats to injure his workers, his wife, and the police officer, a kindergarten class, and an FBI agent on Facebook. The district court instructed the jury that a true threat, which follows outside the scope of the First Amendment speech protections, requires an objective intent to threaten. Alienus appealed and argued that true threats require subjective intent to threaten. So essentially, Alienus was just using the argument that true threats require the person speaking to actually have intention to harm someone else. So the question is, does a conviction of threatening another person under 18 U.S. charges require proof of the defendant's subjective intent to threaten? So I know this is a lot of information. So the question in easy form is, does a conviction of threatening another person require proof that this person really had intent to harm someone? We have to keep in mind that this is on social media, and you're not able to fully gauge someone's intentions behind a screen. So it is a little bit different than dealing with something in the general public. How do you think that the court should rule on this case? Should we limit speech when it comes to social media, especially something that can come across as a threat? Okay, y'all, let me tell you about my friends at 7 Weeks Coffee. 7 Weeks Coffee is America's pro-life coffee company on a mission to fund the pro-life movement one cup of coffee at a time. Why are they called 7 Weeks Coffee? Because at 7 weeks, a baby is the size of a little coffee bean, and it's the same time a heartbeat is clearly detected on an ultrasound. That is why they donate 10% of every sale to support pregnancy care centers across the country. They have raised over $800,000 for these centers and have saved thousands of lives. Now, let me tell you about the coffee because I am very picky about what I put into my body. It's mold-free, pesticide-free, shade-grown, and low-acid, and it's organically farmed. It truly checks all the boxes. So go to 7weekscoffee.com and save 15% forever when you subscribe. Plus, exclusively for my listeners, use the code OFFICIALCCW for an extra 10% off your first order. That's a 25% total savings on your first order. Remember, your order will directly help support a network of over 1,000 pro-life organizations across the U.S. Do y'all remember the comedian Kathy Griffin? If y'all don't remember, Kathy Griffin was the one who posted a picture of Donald Trump's severed head on her Twitter or Instagram. I can't really remember which platform it was, but because she did this, many people were upset. As you can imagine, this is a very violent and it depicted a gruesome death of the president. So I actually remember seeing this in the news, and I remember I was young, and I remember thinking, this is not okay. Like, no matter if you like the person or not, it's not okay to do this at all. So many people were obviously upset, and she in turn lost her job and was threatened to be charged with conspiracy to assassinate the president. So while this may seem extreme, it is in situations like this that make me think about and discuss restrictions on speech. In my opinion, however, I say that we should not have restrictions. People have a right to post, and if it's something violent, it is usually brought to the light. The issue with social media is it is hard to tell a person's intent. They may say those things because they find it funny, but with no intention to actually even harm someone. Again, there are lots of rap songs that have extremely, extremely violent lyrics, y'all. Because remember what Elias posted was from a rap song. I think that anything we do can have consequences. If you post something that can be a threat and violent, but is walking a fine line, just know that there could be consequences even if it does not involve the federal government. Because Kathy Griffin posted what she thought was funny on social media, she lost her job and was put on the no-fly terrorist list. Freedom does not come without responsibility and trade-offs. With all that said, here is how the Supreme Court ruled in Elias v. United States case. Yes, Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr. delivered the opinion for the 8-1 majority. The court held that the prosecution needed to show that Elias intended the post to be threats, and therefore that were a subjective intent to threaten. An objective reasonable person standard does not go far enough to separate innocent accidental conduct from purposeful wrongful acts. The court held that in this case, an objective standard would risk punishing an innocent actor because the crucial elements that make up this behavior criminal is the threat, not merely the posting. So to break that down in simple terms, the court just ruled in Elias's favor, saying that there's no way to really tell if he had intent to harm these people. And because of social media, it is really hard to gauge that. And he also put disclaimers on his posts. Now, I'm not saying he should have done it. He definitely should not have done it. But because he put disclaimers and because it's social media, you're not able to really tell if a person is really intending to threaten someone or hurt someone or if they're just talking. I want y'all to think about this. What you say matters, y'all. And words can really hurt others. No matter if it's typed out on social media or not, we need to be aware of what we say and how we say it. Scripture tells us the following about our words. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruits. Proverbs 18:21. But I tell you that every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give an account thereof on the day of judgment. For by the words thou shalt be justified, and by thy words thou shalt be condemned. Matthew 12:36-37. This is my favorite one. Gracious words are like a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. Proverbs 16:24. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building up others according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. Ephesians 4:29. These are all scriptures that we can take and really just try to memorize throughout the day when we're dealing with our children or dealing with other people, or if we're at work, other coworkers. There's just a lot that we can take from this, and someone may be having a bad day, and if we're mean and rude to them, we are not representing Christ. We have to be the hands and feet of Jesus, and we have to be kind to others. It does not mean that you be a doormat, but it also means that you have to let your words speak life. So while the court ruled in Elias's favor, I'm sure he learned a very valuable and important lesson. What we say matters. Social media is new, and people are really beginning to just get braver and bolder with what is shared. As Christians, we need to understand that we do not need to let any unwholesome talk come out of our mouths, whether that is in real life or on social media, and we have to let our words reflect Jesus. So another example I want to give of censorship is not from America. This actually happened recently, and I want to just briefly discuss it. I'm sure most of us are aware of the situation between Palestine and Israel, and it's getting worse and worse. In my honest opinion, both sides have done wrong, but because I'm using this as an example of freedom of speech, I don't want y'all to take this as me siding with Palestine or Israel. I'm just using this as an example. So don't take this as, oh, Isabel siding with Israel or Isabel siding with Palestine. No, I'm literally just using this article as an example to discuss what censorship really is so that y'all have a better understanding of what censorship is actually like. So this article is from CNN. I'm going to give you the little backstory before we really dive into this article. Essentially, Israeli police had just gotten word that an Israeli bookstore was selling books that were pro-Palestine. So they ransacked this man's bookstore and arrested him. So here's the article from CNN. Don't come at me. I know CNN is super biased to the left, but I'm just reading it so that we can kind of get an understanding of censorship of speech. Muhammad Muna looked on in disbelief as plainclothes Israel police officers rifled the shelves in his decades-old bookstore in occupied East Jerusalem. The officers were looking for books they deemed insightful, and in the process detained him and his nephew Ahmed for 48 hours. The February raid on the two branches of the educational bookshop, a well-known bookstore popular among Palestinians, Israelis, and foreigners, was a widening of what critics describe as a crackdown on free speech in Israel and has intensified since Hamas's October 7th attack. Witnesses to the raid said police were looking for any books containing the word Palestine, a Palestinian flag, its colors, or any symbol of Palestinian national or political identity. Israel's police said at the time they conducted the raid because the stores were suspected of selling books containing an incitement of support of terrorism. On Tuesday, they raided the shop again, detaining Muhammad's father and the shop's co-owner, Imad. So, while this is in Israel, it is still censorship of speech. And if America is not careful, we can absolutely have our rights stripped from us the same way. So, essentially, Israel is preventing their citizens from getting information when it comes to the war over there. And they're preventing them from even just getting books on Palestine, learning about Palestine, because they're saying that if you support Palestine, you support a terrorist group. Again, I'm not saying I'm siding with one side or the other. I'm just using this as an example. And it's clear that the Israeli government is preventing their speech because they only want them to have pro-Israeli information, and they are arresting people who want to seek out different opinions and views. Lastly, I want to briefly mention the story of the Columbia University student Mahmoud Khalil. Someone on the Facebook group actually asked me to give my opinion on this, and I'm going to try to just split it up in different podcast episodes because this is an ongoing investigation and case. And so a lot of the facts we just don't have yet. But for those who don't know, I'm going to give the backstory in this episode, and then the next episode, since we are going to be talking about the right to peaceably assemble and petition the government, we'll talk about this more specifically. Mahmoud Khalil is a Columbia University graduate. He is an immigrant from Algeria. He was born in Syria, but he's also a citizen of Palestine. He is here in America. He had a student visa, and now he has a green card. Essentially, a green card is like temporary citizenship, but the people who have it can stay here a while with it legally in the U.S., but they are not an official citizen of the United States, if that makes sense. So he came here on a student visa to go to Columbia University, and now he has his green card. He is married to an American woman who's actually pregnant right now. And ICE recently detained him as he was heading up the protest at Columbia University last year in favor of Palestine, and some see that as supporting Hamas, which is a terrorist organization that runs the Gaza Strip. Protesters at Columbia University last year were pushing for the university to cut any ties with companies linked to Israel, and these protests quickly turned into what some may call anti-Semitism. So I'm going to read this article from PBS about this specifically, and it says, in recent weeks, the university's new leadership has embarked on listening sessions aimed at cooling tensions, released a report on campus anti-Semitism, and circulated new protest guidelines meant to limit disruption. But student organizers are undeterred, promising to ramp up their actions, including possible encampments, until the university agrees to cut any ties with companies linked to Israel. Keep in mind, this article is published September 3rd, 2024. Okay, so remember, Mahmoud Khalil is the man who was arrested for promoting anti-Semitism, supporting a terrorist organization, whatever you want to call it. This is what he was arrested for. And this is what this article says he said in 2024 of September. As long as Columbia continues to invest and benefit from Israeli apartheid, the students will continue to resist, said Mahmoud Khalil, a graduate student who represented campus protesters in negotiations with the university. Not only protests and encampments, the limit is the sky. That's what he said. So Marco Rubio is our Secretary of State, and he obviously come out and said if you are caught protesting and you do not have permanent residence here in America, and you are protesting for these terrorist organizations, whatever you want to call it, you will be deported. Now, let's just keep in mind that as the Secretary of State, he can do this if he feels that this is a threat to Americans. Now, in my mind, when a university has asked you to please tone it down, stop getting these protesters riled up, and you say the limit is the sky, we're not going to stop until you stop supporting companies tied to Israel, this is, to me, in a sense, a threat. However, we do not have all the details of this case, as more information is still steadily coming in. Something else I want to point out is that Marco Rubio, who is the Secretary of State, according to uscode.housegov.com, it says, in general, an alien whose presence or activities in the United States the Secretary of State has reasonable ground to believe would have potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences for the United States is deportable. So if they find that he is a threat to Americans, that he would be a threat to foreign policy, they can deport him. So this is an ongoing case. I will try to give some more of my opinions and research in the next episode next week on this specifically. But this does deal with freedom of speech because as an American, we have the right to protest. He is not a citizen, but he's still entitled to certain rights that Americans have. And so I think it's important that we note that if he is found guilty and there's not really anything to charge him on, then we kind of do need to look at that and say, what is going on here? There needs to be some type of evidence given to us. He can't just be arrested for protesting, in my opinion. I don't think that's right. However, we don't have all the facts of this case, so we need to just look at that. I want to know what y'all think about this. Do you think he needs to be deported? Do you think he should be found guilty? Or do you think that we need to make sure we have all the information first before we just assume these things and arrest someone? What do y'all think about this? I did just want to briefly mention this because we are talking about freedom of speech, and next week we are going to be talking about the freedom of protesting and things like that. So I just wanted to briefly go over the facts that I was able to gather from online sources and talk about them, but also to ensure that y'all have the facts so that next week when we really dive into it, we'll be able to already have a foundation of some of the details. So with all that being said, now we're going to be talking about freedom of the press. I want to read y'all this quote by Thomas Jefferson, and it says, "The basis of our government being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep that right. And were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspaper or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate for a moment to prefer the latter." Thomas Jefferson said that in 1787. Thomas Jefferson truly understood the importance of having press, and other founders did as well. While we briefly touched on this earlier, I wanted to give some more examples to help you have a better understanding. Remember, y'all, the founding fathers advocated for freedom of the press because they believed in the ideal of the freedom of thought, and they experienced the suppression of their speech and thoughts directly. They wanted to ensure that our rights to freedom of speech and of the press were protected. After the American Revolution, the Sedition Act was passed. So if you're not familiar with the Sedition Act, it is basically just a bill that was passed by John Adams. And it says, the Sedition Act made it a crime for American citizens to print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, or malicious writing about the government. The laws were directed against Democratic Republicans, the party typically favored by new citizens. The only journalists prosecuted under the Sedition Act were editors of the Democratic Republican newspapers, and that's from the archives.gov. So again, John Adams was president when this happened, and it just kind of doesn't really make any sense to me because why would he want to censor speech but then advocate for freedom of speech? Even though our founding fathers were great men, they were still men with sinful desires, and they still desired power. So John Adams signed off this bill. Essentially, articles had been written about him that were not true, and he didn't like it because it wasn't in his favor because he wanted to run for re-election. The act was not popular with Americans. I can imagine why. And someone who was really opposed to this was James Madison. Y'all remember James Madison was the writer of the Bill of Rights. He literally had freedom of speech and rights of Americans at the forefront of his mind. And then a president comes in and signs a bill like this. I'm sure he was furious. Another person who opposed it was, of course, Thomas Jefferson. So I'm going to read his quote one more time. It says, "The basis of our government being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep that right. And were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate for a moment to prefer the latter." Thomas Jefferson truly believed that a government without the freedom of speech and freedom of the press was not worth having. He understood that the press is what keeps the elected officials in check, but also allows Americans to form opinions on political issues of the day. The press has a lot of power to sway people. We've seen that with the last election and the one in 2020, but it also has a lot of power to give truth. Because John Adams was in favor of the Sedition Act and signed off on it, he became very unpopular with the American people, and he actually lost re-election to Thomas Jefferson. Little fun fact for you. Before I give these examples of freedom of the press in action and why having it is important, I want you all to remember that the government has overstepped many times when it comes to this on both sides. And we just saw with the last example that they've tried to do it right after the American Revolution. It is never acceptable to censor speech of the American people, especially the press. Now, I do understand that the media is extremely biased, and it can be really, really frustrating trying to sift through all of the propaganda to find the truth. But during COVID, there was media censorship, and there was censorship even when it came to the election in 2020. No matter who does it, it is wrong. I remember that during COVID, there were some posts that were discussing the vaccine. People were saying, oh, don't get it, it's dangerous. Other people were advocating for it. If you were against the vaccine, your post would automatically be flagged on Facebook and it would be taken down. Even Instagram, I think, too. Another example from my own personal experience is I shared a picture. It was an AI-generated image that Donald Trump shared on his Facebook page or his Instagram page. And it was him holding a cat and a little duck. And I don't even think there was any writing on it. It was just meant to be like a funny, comical photo. I shared it on my Facebook page. My post was taken down for spreading false information. And then Facebook put restrictions on my account, which I still have today for some reason. Even though this is obviously a joke and was harmful in no way, Facebook took my post down and I still have restrictions on my account because of that. According to this Washington Post article, as social media platforms such as YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter have worked to remove or reduce the spread of messages they deem offensive or harmful, conservatives have pushed back, saying that efforts to target conservative opinion and infringe on Americans' freedom of expression. Another article from the committee reads, after reviewing tens of thousands of emails and non-public documents between the Biden White House and Big Tech, the committee's report reveals Big Tech changed their content moderation policies because of the Biden White House. The Biden White House's censorship targeted true information, satire, and other content that did not violate the platform's policies. The Biden White House's censorship campaign had chilling effects on other speech. The White House had leverage because the companies had other policy concerns involving the Biden administration. The White House pushed censorship of books, not just social media. While the Biden White House pressure campaign largely succeeded, its effects were devastating. By suppressing free speech and intentionally distorting public debate in the modern town square, ideas and policies were no longer fairly tested and debated on their merits. So that's part of the article. Now, there are censorship examples on both sides that I want to get into. I just want to preface this and say that I love Donald Trump. I admire him a lot. I think he's doing great things for our country. But that does not mean that I have to agree with everything that he does. And I say that because recently there was a story where he kicked out the Associated Press because he did not like what they were reporting on. This happened pretty recently. So J.D. Vance had went to Germany to discuss freedom of speech with other countries because he fears that the citizens' rights over there are being infringed upon and they're in danger. So while J.D. Vance was over there talking about freedom of speech, back in the U.S., Trump literally kicked out the Associated Press. And they were kicked out because they kept referring to the Gulf of America as the Gulf of Mexico. And Trump got really, really mad. While I don't like the AP, they are extremely left-leaning and share false information a lot. It is not right to censor speech of Americans. While they can still essentially cover news on Trump, they were prevented from going in with other press at the Oval Office. So this is an article from BBC, and this is talking about J.D. Vance's speech. Keep in mind, BBC is British, like a British news company. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance has launched a scalding attack on European democracies, saying the greatest threat facing the continent was not from Russia and China, but from within. It had been expected that Vance would use his speech at the Munich Security Conference to address possible talks to end the war with Ukraine. Instead, he spent the majority accusing European governments, including the UK's, of retreating from their values and ignoring voter concerns on migration and free speech. So while this situation is very, very, very minor in the grand scheme of things, it is important because censorship of speech, regardless, is not right. We have to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And the reality is whether you like the AP or not, many Americans use the AP to get their news source. If the Biden administration had kicked out Fox News reporters and told them they weren't allowed to come back, conservatives would be up in arms about that. We would be so upset because we would say, this is censorship. What is happening? When J.D. Vance was in Germany trying to talk to them about censorship and freedom of speech, Trump kicked out the AP because he didn't like what they had to say and the news they covered. Other countries, y'all, read these headlines, and it is just not a good look for America. They look at us and see hypocrisy. In addition to this, it does not help the citizens of other countries who are looking to us as an example as they advocate for their rights too. While I dislike the AP again and they spread false information a lot, Trump should not have kicked them out of the Oval Office. So this article is according to the Associated Press about what happened. The Associated Press is asking for a federal judge for a second time to immediately restore its access to presidential events, arguing that the Trump White House has doubled down on retaliating against the news outlet for its refusal to follow the president's executive order that renamed the Gulf of Mexico. U.S. District Court Judge Trevor N. McFadden last week refused AP's request for an injunction to lift the ban against many of its reporters and photographers. But McFadden noted that this case law weighed against the White House and urged the administration to reconsider before a scheduled second hearing on March 20th. Again, y'all, censorship happens on both sides. It's not just the left, it's also the right. And while this may be minor in comparison to the last presidency, it is still censorship. And something important to remember is the government should not actively try to suppress information or news organizations. We as Americans should be loyal to the Constitution and rights over any one person or policy. Another case I want to mention, this is the last one, is Schenck v. United States. And this was a test case I referred to earlier at the beginning of this episode about shouting fire in a crowded theater. This case is from OIEZ.com and it reads, during World War I, socialists Charles Schenck and Elizabeth Baer distributed leaflets declaring that the draft violated the 13th Amendment prohibition against involuntary servitude. The leaflets urged the public to disobey the draft, but advised only peaceful action. Schenck was charged with conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act of 1917 by attempting to cause insubordination in the military and to obstruct recruitment. Schenck and Baer were convicted of violating this law and appealed on the grounds that the statute violated the First Amendment. So the question is, did Schenck's conviction under the Espionage Act for criticizing the draft violate the First Amendment right to freedom of speech? So if you're not familiar with the Espionage Act, it is basically just an act or law that prohibited obtaining information, recording pictures, or copying descriptions of any information relating to the national defense with intent or reason to believe that the information may be used for the injury of the United States or the advantage of any foreign nation. So they were saying that because he was passing out these flyers that were telling people, oh, ignore the draft, don't listen to the government, this was actually hurting America and actually creating an advantage to foreign nations because we wouldn't have soldiers to fight in the war. We were literally in the middle of a war. So the court ruled that the Espionage Act did not violate the First Amendment. It was an appropriate exercise of Congress's wartime authority. Writing a unanimous court, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes concluded that the court owed greater deference to the government during wartime, even when the constitutional rights were at stake. Articulating for the first time the clear and present danger test, which is the fire test, Holmes concluded that the First Amendment does not protect speech that approaches creating a clear and present danger of a significant evil that Congress has no power to prevent. Famously, he compared the leaflets to falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, which is not permitted under the First Amendment, which we talked about that at the beginning of this podcast episode. So because Charles Schenck and Elizabeth Bear were passing these flyers out, advocating for people ignore the draft, don't listen to the government, don't do it, they were harming America, and they were literally giving an advantage to foreign nations, and this was not okay. And they used the argument, Charles did, of, oh, it's freedom of speech. Well, unfortunately, that did not fly in the Supreme Court, and they said because of the Espionage Act, this was actually something that did not violate the First Amendment, and it was an appropriate exercise of Congress's wartime authority. Okay, guys, we're going to hear from my friends from Back to the Basics 101. Back to the Basics 101 is a small business owned by Johnny and Ginger Butts. They are a farming family who are also believers. Basics, in their name, Back to the Basics 101, is an acronym for Brothers and Sisters in Christ Service. Ginger believes that when we're saved, discipled, and healthy, we can enjoy the abundant life Jesus talks about in John 10:10. Their family has experienced healing from what Ginger calls modern diseases through God's creation. Back to the Basics 101 produces 4 product lines to help consumers get nutrition from the source. Each of their product lines get you as close to the point of nutrition as possible. For instance, their homemade baking mixes are made from the wheat they grow in Middle Georgia. Ginger then takes the wheat to a miller who raises the gate to his pond, which activates the 4-foot stone mill that grinds their wheat berries into flour. She keeps the process primitive to ensure the consumer gets nutrients at their peak. Their other 3 product lines include a plant protein blend, elderberries, and more ultimate syrup kit and seasonings. I just want to say that every time I feel a cold coming on, I use Ginger's elderberry syrup kit, and it is so good. My mom always keeps it in the fridge, and if we ever feel a cold coming on, we will take the elderberry syrup. So good for you. Highly recommend. So go to backtothebasics101.com and use code CCW10 for 10% off your first order. Again, that's backtothebasics101.com, code CCW10 for 10% off your first order. Follow them on Instagram and Facebook to see all their small batch products to help make a healthier you. The Founding Fathers took a lot of care when founding America. And while there are things that may seem to be an infringement on our First Amendment rights, we have to be very careful to get the whole picture before we make that claim. There are things we can and cannot do when it comes to free speech. This freedom is one of the most important parts of what it means to be a U.S. citizen in the United States. But we do have to be responsible and use discernment. What are your thoughts on Trump kicking out the AP? I really want to hear what y'all think about that. I wonder if y'all even heard about it. What are your thoughts when it comes to free speech and social media? Should it be illegal to post content on social media that can be considered violent? Have you been censored on social media when it comes to posts during COVID or the election? I would like to know all these things. This really just helps me better my knowledge and really just helps spark debate, healthy debate, of course. I have learned so much, y'all, for studying for this podcast, and I really hope that I was able to break all this down and explain it well. I tried to use a bunch of different situations and scenarios. I really hope that it makes sense. I want to say again that I do appreciate the Trump and his administration. I am a Trump girly. I wear my merch all the time. I admire him a lot, but it does not mean I have to agree with every single thing he does. Freedom of speech is a right, and we should not take it for granted. So we have examples from recent things going on in the news, but we also have examples from things that happened a long time ago when it comes to freedom of speech, what our founding fathers intended, and how even they at times overstepped on and infringed on this right. So with all that being said, I'm just so grateful for every single one of y'all. I am so happy you listened to this episode, and thank you for joining me in my effort to better understand our rights as Americans so that we can better navigate life with liberty, truth, and grace. If you love this podcast episode or this podcast, please share it with just one friend. I would really appreciate that. It just helps to expand the CCW community, but also the Voices of Liberty community. And I'm just so thankful for every single one of you. And if you share with one friend and send a screenshot of proof to voicesoflibertycontact@gmail.com, I will send you an exclusive CCW sticker in the mail, but also I will give you a shout out on the podcast and website. I am so excited to be doing this, and I really hope that y'all continue to join me for the next episode.